of course, is a lecture for this evening. We're going to try to start as promptly as possible. My name is Kate Timoni. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Religion. And this event is graciously been put together not only by our department, which is the Department of Religion, as several of my colleagues are here, and I'm so happy to see them, but then also the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education Project, as well as the Center for Faith and Spirituality have generously supported this event, along with Justice Studies and Political Science and Law. So this truly is a collaborative effort, and I appreciate all of those sponsors of this event. Before we get to our main event for the evening, it's like a wrestling match, right? which is Faraz Sanei. I just want to share a couple of upcoming events that many of those that are sponsoring this event have as well. So I have them here for you. For those of you out there with your cameras, feel free to take pictures. So these are some of the upcoming events. So we have tomorrow, actually 2 events, Women of Color Health Symposium, tomorrow the 21st, that'll be at 2:00 p.m. in the Student Center Ballroom A. And then also in light of recent events, this being the New Zealand terrorist attack, there will be also a panel discussion tomorrow. And the panel discussion name is They Are Us. That will be at 4:00 p.m. tomorrow in Student Center Ballroom C. And then after the panel discussion, there'll be a vigil. Then on Friday, March 22nd, there'll be the 2019 Social Justice Conference. And registration will begin at 8:30 a.m. and that's also at the Student Center Ballroom. We also have Political Science and Law. We'll bring in Mrs. Stacy McDougall, and she'll be giving a lecture, An American Peacemaker in United Nations Missions in Liberia and Haiti. That'll be on Tuesday the 26th. That'll be in this building, University Hall 1050 at 1. We also have Cornell Brooks coming in. He's a past president and CEO of the NAACP. And he is giving a lecture called A Woke Democracy on Wednesday, March 27th. So that'll be at that beautiful brand new building, the School of Communication and Media, room 140, and that'll be from 5:30 to 7. There will also be on April 1st, a pretty nifty opportunity, which will be a lecture, a book signing, a documentary screening, and a teacher education seminar. So a pretty involved program from 4:00 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And it's actually not here. It's at Raritan Valley Community College. That's about 45 minutes to an hour drive away from here. But the Department of Religion, and again, the program that Zoe Burkholder, who's here, that she heads up, which is the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education Project, as well as a program I work with, which is called the Genocide Education Prevention Project, that I founded with another colleague at another institution, as well as the Institute for the Humanities. They've all come together to offer this opportunity. So if you are an MSU student or a faculty member, especially if you're planning on becoming a teacher, this is a really great program because you get a free copy of the book. Your registration fee is waived, that's paid by us, and you'll also get a free meal. And then if you are a teacher, you'll get teacher credit for doing it as well, professional development credit. So if you're interested in that, the link is there as how to apply. We also have some flyers if you're interested in that. On April 4th, the Department of Religion with others is doing a discussion on gay men's health. So that's Thursday, April 4th. That is John Manuel Androit, author of Stonewall Strong. That's from 1 to 2:30, again, in this building, and it's actually even in this room. So it's in 1020. So see y'all here on April 4th in this room. We'll just do this all over again. And then last, the Office of Social Justice and Diversity is taking applications. So you can be a peer leader, and also if you're a graduate student, they have a coordinator position open if you want to work with the Women's Center and the LGBTQ Center, and they're currently taking applications. So as you can see, there is a cornucopia of things going on at this institution. I certainly encourage you to avail yourself of these opportunities. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to talk to me. And I also have applications for the April 1 event at Raritan Valley Community College. So without further ado, I will then read the introduction, short bio of our featured speaker for this evening, Faraz Sanei. And thank you so much for being here. Every now and again, you get these phenomenal opportunities where you meet somebody of his stature and with his experience, and this is actually our first time meeting each other face to face. We have corresponded through email, and we have similar research interests, but it's through a mutual colleague that we actually connected to each other. So he is a visiting instructor of clinical law at the Telford Taylor Teaching Fellow and a Telford Fellow Teaching Fellow with Benjamin B. Friends Human Rights, this is a mouthful. B. Friends Human Rights and Atrocity Prevention Center at the Cardozo School of Law. Did you get all that? Okay, he's really important. Okay, so prior to joining Cardozo, he was the director of the Project for Freedom of Religion or Belief at the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies, the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and a legal advisor to Dr. Ahmed Shahid, who is the current UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. From 2010 to 2015, Faraz was the Iran and Gulf researcher at Human Rights Watch, where he conducted field investigations, published in-depth reports on human rights violations in the region, and represented the organization in media interviews and advocacy meetings with relevant stakeholders. His work has been cited and published in major newspapers and outlets, including the New York Times, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and The Guardian, and others. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, Faraz was the interim executive director, program director, and senior human rights lawyer at the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. He holds a JD from Vanderbilt Law School, where he served as a managing editor of the Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law, and a BA in political science from the University of California at Los Angeles. After law school, he joined the law firm of Snell and Wilmer in Phoenix, Arizona, very different from New York, where he concentrated on commercial litigation, environmental, and regulatory matters. He has been an adjunct professor with Hunter's College Human Rights Program since 2015. So if you would please join me in giving Faraz Sanei JD a warm
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to see that Professor Timoni doesn't use the mic, because I'm not a big fan of mics, but I think my voice is loud enough so that everyone can hear it. If at any point you can't hear me, just raise your hand or gesture and let me know. And I tend to walk around sometimes, so it's difficult to have a stationary mic. Thank you very much to the religion department at Montclair State University, to Montclair State University, to Professor Timoni for inviting me, to all of her colleagues at the department, and all of the other supporters, which I've now lost track of. There were so many of them. But I'm glad to see that you folks are interested in this particular issue, in the issue of freedom of religion. And I'm glad that you're all here. Hopefully, my objective is to have a talk. Hopefully it won't get too technical and too legal. My background is law. So there's going to be some international law, some human rights law in there. If at any point something isn't clear, feel free to raise your hand and talk, or wait until the Q&A session, whatever works best. I'm very flexible in terms of having interruptions and talking and having a conversation with you. And then I guess the final thing I would say, it's a bit of a disclaimer, in addition to the fact that, in fact, I have a very long title, and I always think that there's an inverse relationship between the length of one's title and how important they actually are. So keep that in mind. I came to the world of religion actually somewhat late in life. I don't necessarily describe myself as a religious person. I think some of the professors, Professor Timoni and the religion department, the folks who are here probably have more substantive knowledge about particular religious traditions than I do. This talk is going to be much more about the kind of human rights framework and the legal framework around freedom of religion, less about the substance of religious doctrine, religious beliefs, so on and so forth. That's relevant. It will be relevant, but I'm not going to talk about that as much, in part because I'm not an expert in it. And in fact, just on a personal note, I come from, I think the reason that I'm drawn to this issue actually is because I come from a very multi-faith family. So I was born in Iran. I came to the States when I was about 8 years old in 1983. You can do the math. I don't want to hear any numbers after that. And I came from a multi-faith family in a country that is predominantly Muslim and predominantly Shia Muslim, right? So my mother is Jewish, my father is ethnic Azerbaijani, Turkic Azerbaijani, and Shia. I have cousins who are Christian. I have cousins who are Sunni because there's a Kurdish side of my family. This is all because Iran is actually a very multi-ethnic and somewhat multi-faith country. There is a large Christian community. There used to be a large Jewish community. Most of them have left since the revolution. So, the idea of religion was actually very scary to me when I was growing up. And I kind of shied away from it, to be honest. I never felt like I belonged in any of the individual communities, whether it was Jewish, Christian, Shia, Sunni, Kurdish, Turkic, Persian, whatever it is, right? But over time, I think I've always had this kind of obsession, actually, and fascination with religion and religious identity, right? And what it means for me. And I guess putting aside the personal and kind of going into the lecture, the one last thing I will say is that today is the first day of spring. I don't know if any of you know that, but it is in fact the vernal equinox, the first day of spring. And in Iran, and in many of the countries in the Middle East and in Central Asia, this is actually a very important day, right? Both traditionally, but also religiously, right? So this, in Iran, the religion before Islam came to Iran, the established religion of the state was Zoroastrianism, right? Nowruz, which means new day, which is the first day of spring, right? It actually comes from a Zoroastrian tradition. Yesterday I went with my partner to the East Village in Manhattan and we jumped over fire, right? Which is fire is a very important part of the Zoroastrian faith, right? So in Iran, even though it's a Muslim country, even though it is, clerics rule the country in many ways, that's qualified, but this Zoroastrian tradition survives to this day, right? They weren't able to get rid of that tradition, right? And Christians, Jews, Muslims, Baha'is, right? And I'll talk a little bit about Baha'is as well, in Iran, all celebrate the first day of spring, which goes back to the Zoroastrian tradition. Okay, enough of that. So let's talk a little bit about why this issue is important. Why is the issue of freedom of religion important? And I wanted to kind of talk about the challenges first, right? The challenges when we think of freedom of religion. And maybe some of the challenges are the reasons that all of you came to this lecture, right? So the first thing I think about as a challenge is, what is the relationship between the state and religion, right? That is a fundamental challenge that all of us who are in human rights law and in international law, and even in the field of religion, often think about, right? What is the relationship between state and religion here in the United States, right? We have separation of church and state, right? We have this idea that there should be some wall. Now, how thick that wall is, how thin that wall is, changes over time, right? But that there is a relationship between, that if state is too entangled in religion, there will be problems, right? The foundations of this country, to a certain extent, are based on the separation between church and state, right? You have other countries like France, who has a secularism, laïcité, right? This idea of secularism, which is very, very different than the idea of secularism, separation of church and state here in the United States, right? Very, very different idea. You have countries that have official religions, right? Many countries, Iran has an official religion. It's not just Islam, it is 12er Shia Islam. It's 3 degrees of separation, right? So it's Muslim, Islam, then Shiism, then under Shiism, you have 12er Shiism, which is the state religion of Iran, right? What does that mean for Christians? What does that mean for Jews? What would it mean if the official religion of the United States was Christianity, right? What would it mean if it was evangelical Christianity? What if it was Protestant? What if it was Catholicism? These are all questions that we grapple with, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that. International human rights law, which is what I kind of study and do work on these days, doesn't actually have a prescription for whether or not there should be a particular relationship between religion and state, right? My former boss, Ahmad Shahid, UN Special current UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means and who cares about the fact that there's a UN Special Rapporteur, right? He never goes around and says a state should be secular, or a state should be, should not have an official religion. He doesn't explicitly say that. But query, is it possible to have an official religion and not discriminate? Is it possible? Right? So it's something that I want you guys to think about as we go through this discussion. So that's the first thing. Second thing is discrimination. Many of us are here today probably because the first thing we think about when we think about religion is that it creates a motivation for discrimination. Discrimination on the basis of religion. Right? It's talked about all the time. We are grappling with that issue here in this country, right? And it's not only since the Trump administration came into power. It's been an issue for a long time in this country, right? Christchurch, we talk about it, with all of the things that led up to the massacre in Christchurch in New Zealand, right? We talk about the Muslim travel ban in this country. I mean, discrimination is one of those issues that is, I would say, probably one of the most fundamental challenges and problems in human rights law, but also just in terms of humanity, right? The way, the othering, right? Othering, us versus them. You're either with us or you're not with us, right? And the foundations or the reasons for discrimination, religion is often one of the primary reasons. There are other reasons as well, right? Race, nationality, disability, gender, sex/gender, right? All of those are bases upon which to discriminate, but religion is often quite a powerful motivation for discrimination. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Under discrimination, you can think about discrimination in three different ways. You can think about discrimination by the state, right? By the government, right? So when we think about the travel ban, for instance, that could be an example of discrimination by the state, okay? An example of it. Of course, there would be individuals who would say that's not discriminatory whatsoever, right? And we can have a debate about that. But there are serious allegations that it is in fact motivated by religious animus against the Muslim community, right? Then you can have discrimination by particular entities, right? Whether it be businesses, right? So we think about, you guys have heard about Masterpiece Cake Shop, right? This cake shop in Colorado who had a devout Christian who was baking cakes, and an LGBT couple came into the store, wanted to order a cake, right, for their marriage. And once he found out that it was for them, that it was for their marriage, he said, I'm very, very sorry, but my religious beliefs do not allow me to bake a cake for you, right? That was actually in violation of the Colorado state law, right? Which in fact protected individual LGBT from discrimination in places of public accommodation, right? And Masterpiece Cake Shop was a place of public accommodation. So that's an example of a business discriminating. You can also have other groups discriminating, right? You can have armed groups, right, who are not part of the state, right? So one of your colleagues works on international terrorism, or I don't know if it's international terrorism, but terrorism and religion, right? Oftentimes armed groups, Boko Haram in Nigeria, right? ISIS is the one that we think about quite often, right? In Syria, Iraq, and now actually even in Afghanistan and other areas, right? In Southwest Asia and the Middle East, right? They can also discriminate. And then there's discrimination by individuals, right? Discrimination by individuals. And it's always an interesting question in law. Is it unlawful for individuals to discriminate? The reality is we all discriminate, right? In our private lives, right, we make particular choices to hang out with certain people and not to hang out with other people, right? You can think of that as a form of discrimination. It's not state discrimination. It's not discrimination by a business entity that is regulated by the state. It is individual discrimination, right? To what extent should law or international human rights law or domestic law have anything to say about who we want to associate with and who we don't want to associate with, right? Something to think about. Third, violence. Another reason why I think a lot of you are probably here, right? Violence can be perpetrated on the basis of religion by the state. So you think of the example of Myanmar and the Rohingya, right? The minority group in Myanmar that have effectively been rendered stateless, right? Rohingya are primarily Muslim, right? There are questions as to whether or not it is their religious identity and their faith that is the motivation for the discrimination, or if it's other reasons. But certainly, their faith is a very big part of their identity, and most of us believe that it plays a role in the discrimination and the atrocity crimes that are being perpetrated by the Burmese government, by Myanmar, right? So, violence by the state. You can have entities that engage in violence. I talked about Boko Haram. Boko Haram, an armed group, right? The Taliban in Afghanistan engage in lots of violence on the basis of religion, right? Takfiris, right? This idea of Muslims the idea that, I'm Muslim, you claim that you're Muslim, but in fact you are not Muslim enough. Therefore you are an apostate, you are not Muslim, right? This is, religious extremism, some people would call it, right? A lot of violence, actually, is not inter-religious violence, it's Muslim-on-Muslim violence. When you look at, for instance, in Afghanistan, right, most of the victims of the Taliban are Muslims. The Taliban claim to be Sunni, right? Most of their victims are in fact Sunni Afghans. There are also Shias, Hazaras who are their victims, so on and so forth, right? So, violence by entities. The fourth challenge is limitations or restrictions on religion that are not discriminatory, right? So, if a state has an official religion, and let's say it's religion X, and there's a minority that practices religion Y, if the state says, religion Y, you can't have any houses of worship, right? You can't have any mosques, you can't have any churches, you can't have any synagogues, right? That's discrimination. That's a restriction on their ability to pray and worship in a house of worship. And it's clearly discriminatory, right? Question, are all restrictions and limitations on the practice of religion discriminatory? I would submit to you that it is not always discriminatory, right? That there are reasons, and it's built into international law, that you can actually restrict religion and religious practice, right? And prove that it's not discriminatory, and actually win in court, right? I just put court in there because there isn't really an international court, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about that as well. And the other thing I would say is this idea of religious accommodations, right? You have regimes that are out there, regulatory regimes that are out there. So the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, I think, is a perfect example of this, right? There's an anti-discrimination statute in the state of Colorado that protects LGBT persons in places of public accommodation. If someone refuses to sell to you because you are LGBT, right, that is violating the anti-discrimination law in the state of Colorado, right? The owner of Masterpiece Cake Shop said, first of all, I'm not discriminating, right? I'm not discriminating. But even if you say that I'm discriminating, I should be exempted from the anti-discrimination law. Why? Because you are forcing me to bake a cake for someone that I do not want to bake a cake for because it violates my religious beliefs. So that is bringing into tension and conflict freedom of religion and equality/non-discrimination. An issue that we are grappling with not only here in the United States, but all over the world. All over the world, right? So these, I would say, are some of the biggest challenges. And then the final one that kind of implicates religion is hate speech. What do we do with hate speech, right? That is actually, in some ways, maybe even more of a hot button or hot topic issue now than even discrimination in some ways. What do we do with hate speech on social media platforms, on Twitter, right? What do we do? The Christchurch killer, right, was obviously on social media platforms. Some of them are not easily accessible. I don't know, the dark web. I'm not a tech person, by the way, so if any of you have the terminology and I'm saying the terminology wrong, please correct me. I'm not at all a tech person. I am on Twitter. I do like Twitter. although I should probably get off of it at some point. Anyway, but hate speech is a very serious issue. And I want to kind of unpack what we mean by hate speech and what international human rights law has to say about hate speech. And what the United States has to say about hate speech, right? Because the standards under international human rights law for hate speech are the threshold for what can be prohibited as hate speech. And I put it in quotes because there is no legal or universal definition under international human rights law for hate speech. It doesn't exist. I'll read you what the definition is, right? But it's not called hate speech, right? So we'll talk a little bit about the challenge there as well. All right. One other thing before I talk a little bit about the framework, the normative framework, and also some of the misconceptions about what freedom of religion actually means, right? When you think of freedom of religion, you can think of religion being used as a justification to limit or restrict other human rights. Or you could think of an action that is targeting your religious practice and restricting your ability to freely exercise your religion. Those are related, but they are somewhat different from each other. So as we're talking about some of these examples, think about that, right? So, when a state says you can't build your house of worship, that is directly limiting or restricting your manifestation of your religious beliefs. And I'll talk about what I mean by manifestation of religious beliefs, right? But if someone is using religion to, for instance, restrict your right to education, or to restrict your right to health services, right? We talk about this issue of religion and abortion, right? Religion being used by lots of states as a way to restrict other rights, not necessarily your ability to practice your religion, right? That also is an issue that is front and center when we talk about freedom of religion. But there are kind of two different ways of looking at how freedom of religion is implicated, or the role of religion vis-a-vis other rights, right? Okay, misconception. So let me now talk about the international human rights framework and what we mean by religion. First of all, freedom of religion is about humans. It is not about ideas. It is not about beliefs. What do I mean by that, right? Ideas and beliefs don't have human rights. Individuals have human rights, okay? So individuals, not religions, convictions, belief systems, or truth claims are the rights holders to be able to exercise freedom of religion or belief, okay? Why is this important? Because when a state has a law that says if a general blasphemy law, right? If you curse the sacred in our country, right? Or if you say something horrible about the Catholic faith in our country, we are going to throw you in prison, right? The Catholic faith does not have human rights. It cannot exercise human rights. Individual Catholics can, and we can have a discussion as to whether or not, an insult to a Catholic is something that a state should get involved in. We can have that discussion. But just cursing, I don't know, a prophet or someone who's long dead or, a religious belief system or whatever else should not trigger, right, the state intervening to protect human rights, because only individuals can exercise human rights. First important thing. Freedom of religion or belief. So my former boss is UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, okay? Belief is somewhat distinguished from religion. So there's this question, I was having a discussion with one of your colleagues from the economics department, I believe, earlier, and he asked me, what exactly is the definition of religion in international human rights law? And as a lawyer, I fudged, because lawyers fudge all the time, and I said, well, there isn't really an explicit definition of religion. Plus, it's religion or belief, right? So, okay, well, what's belief? Okay, well, belief is not opinion, okay? All right, what exactly does that mean? How is belief different from opinion? Does anyone have any guesses as to why the name is religion or belief? Anyone have any ideas?
Could it possibly be because there are certain ideologies that are not, that you cannot I guess you could say, mold into a particular religion that has been already created.
Okay.
Or I guess you could say that it's malleable.
Okay, okay, all right, that's good. Anybody else? Any ideas? So the idea is, yeah, I mean, there are certain religious traditions that are recognized. There are others that may not be recognized, right? So there is no, as long as you have a religious identity and a religious belief, and as long as you have a belief system, and by the way, belief could be agnosticism, atheism, or you could just not really care about religion, right? You just don't want to think about it. That's also could be a belief system, vis-a-vis religion, right? Now, anthropologists, sociologists, religious studies folks may have different ideas of religion. I'm actually interested to see how religion is defined there. But in the international human rights field, right, religion generally means a belief system that has to do with the cosmic sense of the world, your place in the world. That's how belief is somewhat different than opinion. I can have a political opinion that, whatever, Republicans are better than Democrats, or Democrats are better than Republicans, right? That generally doesn't have anything to do with where I think I came from and where I think I'm going and what my relationship to the heavens and the hells and whatever else is, right? I'm not doing a very good job. It's not very articulate, right? But belief system is very broadly defined, right? And in general, the international human rights system shouldn't really say, well, you're not Catholic because you're not going to confession, on a regular basis, right? That's religion is really identified by the individual. It's defined by the individual. Belief is defined by the individual. Again, human rights, right? Okay. The freedom of religion or belief is a qualified right. What does that mean? Under international human rights law, actually under domestic law, under First Amendment law, under First Amendment jurisprudence, right? The free exercise clause of the First Amendment, right? Freedom of religion is qualified. It is not absolute. What does that mean? Anyone?
There are qualifications and conditions attached to it, where it limits it to some degree.
Yes, yes, very good. So freedom of religion or belief, there is, and let me quickly read to you Article 18 of the ICCPR, which deals with freedom. Actually, you know what? I'm going to hold off on that. I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that. Freedom of religion or belief has two components, right? And this is kind of legal, and there's Latin thrown in, and I remember when I had to deal with Latin for the SATs. Still scarred for life, but just bear with me, okay? Freedom of religion or belief has an internal, it's called forum internum, an internal conscience portion of it, and forum externum, an external portion to freedom of religion or belief. The internal portion is your conscience, is your ability to adopt a religion or not to adopt a religion. It's whatever you believe in your mind, whatever you believe in your heart, whatever you believe here, right? That is the forum internum. Forum externum is the manifestation of your religion. What is an example of a manifestation of your religion?
How it may affect others near you.
Very good, yes, very good, but give me a more concrete example.
A ritual?
Very good, a ritual.
Yeah, I was going to say ritual. Yeah.
Worship, prayer, your dress, right? Those are all manifestations of your faith, right? Now, your forum internum is absolutely protected. Your forum externum is qualified. There can be limitations imposed by the state per international human rights law on your forum externum, on your manifestation. Why is it? Why is it that the law, rightly or wrongly, and we can debate this, and we can also debate, by the way, whether you can really have a bright line test between what's here and what's here. Because I'm not so sure you can, right? But the law has to come up with all sorts of ways to deal with itself, right? And to enforce itself and to implement itself. So that's what we have in international human rights law, okay? So why is it that your forum internum is absolutely protected. And what is an example of an interference with your forum internum?
Well, I would think that the forum internum is considered absolute because it's not a shared space.
Okay.
Whereas the externum is a shared space, and it is unavoidable that you've got multiple people wanting to do different things with that space. So there is no way that everyone can have an absolute freedom to express themselves any way they want.
The economics person talking about negative externalities. Fair enough. Good. I like it. Yeah. I think that's right. So what is an example of a state actually interfering with your forum internum? What, having some sort of technology machine to go into your head to see whether you're Muslim or you believe in, Jesus or whatever? Like,
I was just going to say, you also can't monitor the internal dynamics. You don't know what somebody's intents or motives or ideas are.
oh, I'm not so sure we can't monitor that anymore, but okay, we may be close so far. Okay, we may be close to monitoring those types of things, which is another reason why I don't like technology. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, we don't have that capacity, right? But what capacity do we have? What if there were a law that said, you can't change your religion, or everybody has to, everyone has to subscribe to religion X, and we're going to go in everyone's homes, and we're going to, have a nice friendly chat to see whether or not you actually believe in the precepts of our faith. And if you don't pass our test, don't worry about it. We'll get back to you in terms of what's going to happen, right? Is that an interference with forum internum?
Yes.
I would say so. I would say that it is. As distinct from, and I'll get to you, as distinct from saying that, if your religion believes in animal sacrifice, right, as an example, right, we can restrict it on the basis of what? Give me one reason why the state may want to restrict or limit animal sacrifice.
Animal cruelty.
Animal cruelty could be one, absolutely, yeah. Any others?
Endangered animals?
Yeah, endangering animals, animal cruelty, yeah, that could be an interest of the state.
Like animals that are protected? Like
Yes, very true. But also public health and safety reasons, right? I mean, you can think of it that way. There were two hands. I think you had your hand up.
Doesn't it make more sense if we can control the external versus the internal? Assuming someone can easily lie about the internal, but the external, your presentation of your faith, wouldn't that make more sense if that's the absolute and then the other one is not the absolute?
I never even really thought about it that way. I like it though. I like it. Does anyone have thoughts about that?
I think one of the things we run into is in terms of your identity is what's external, what's internal.
Right.
I mean, no matter what. I mean, when you're talking about human rights, and we're talking about human as a physical body, but if it starts seeping over into corporations as persons or anything like that, then what's internal, what's external. I'd go further if you think about divine being. Does it have anything that's external? Isn't it all internal? So how do you deal with that?
I mean, I think this kind of highlights what I said before, that there is this artificial, the law is creating somewhat of an artificial test in terms of what is external and what is internal, right? I mean, I would argue that an act of prayer is both form internum and form externum, right? How does one divide the line between an act of prayer, right? There was another hand that was up, or there wasn't? No. Okay, all right. So just think of that. Freedom of religion is qualified in the sense that most of the things that the state tries to limit are actually externalities, is form external, is the rituals, the houses of worship. Those are the things that are usually targeted by the state. Usually, states don't engage in inquisitions. Usually, they do sometimes, but usually they don't. Okay. All right. So that's Article 18, and we'll get to that in a little bit. I'll give you the word for the actual verbiage for Article 18, which defines the right to freedom of religion or belief. Right. Freedom of religion or belief is one of the few rights in the international human rights sphere that is non-derogable. Does anyone know what that means? It's a horrible word.
Not derived from something?
Not derogable, non-derogable. You cannot derogate from it. So it means that most human rights, like the right to freedom of expression, the right to privacy, the right to freedom of association, the right to freedom of assembly, all of those rights are qualified, by the way. Those are all qualified rights, but they are also derogable, meaning that in times of emergencies, states can actually just suspend them. They can just suspend them. Freedom of religion or belief is one of the few freedoms or rights that cannot be suspended during times of emergency. Right? Both the forum externum and the forum internum. Query, why does the international human rights system decide to give this somewhat privileged status to religion as opposed to other rights, right? Think about it as we go forward. And then I already talked about this in terms of state-religion dynamics. You know, international human rights law doesn't say anything about whether or not you have to be a theocracy or a democracy or an authoritarian system or whatever else. Now, the reality is if you're an authoritarian system, you will probably be violating lots of rights. If you're a democracy, you'll also be violating lots of rights. There is no country out there that does not violate human rights. I can assure you. There is no country out there that doesn't violate. Some may be better than others, depending on what your metrics are, depending on what rights you're talking about, right? But, you know, Article 18 doesn't say you cannot be a theocracy. Article 18 doesn't say you can't have, you know, religion X as your official religion. However, right, you can have it, but it will look at how you're actually practicing, right? What rights are you giving? What rights are you respecting? Are you discriminating against individuals who don't subscribe to your official religion? They will do that. And usually the evidence will bear itself out that theocracies and authoritarian systems and, you know, totalitarian systems, right? And I won't get into the details of what we're talking about there, right? I'll leave that to the political scientists, right? They generally violate more rights than democracies do. Doesn't mean democracies don't violate rights. Okay. So now let me talk about some of the articles of, anyone ever heard of the ICCPR? Forget about the ICCPR. Anyone ever heard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Yes. Most of us have heard of the Universal Declaration.
As I look at my class.
Right? The kind of founding aspirational document that creates the international human rights system, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not itself a binding treaty, right? It was not an international human rights treaty. It led to a whole bunch of international human rights treaties after that, right? The biggest one, or one of the most important ones, is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We refer to it as the ICCPR, and its brother or sister covenant, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I will throw this at you because we're in the United States. The United States doesn't really care that much about the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, right? They care quite a bit about the ICCPR. They have signed and ratified the ICCPR, right? Okay. Article 2 of the ICCPR, right, which is the, again, when we talk about international human rights and international human rights treaties, always think of the ICCPR because the right to freedom of expression, association, you know, all of the kind of fundamental rights that we often think about, right, are actually in the ICCPR. And it's a binding treaty. The US has signed and ratified it, which means that the United States has to implement it in its domestic legislation. Every country that signs and ratifies the ICCPR has to implement the ICCPR and the protections within their domestic law, right? That's what international human rights law means, okay? So Article 2 of the ICCPR says that all of the rights that are enumerated in the ICCPR, once you sign and ratify a treaty, the state has a duty to respect, a duty to protect, and a duty to fulfill those rights. So, when we're talking about the freedom of religion or belief, Article 18 of the ICCPR, I'm not going to test you don't need to memorize that, right? But when we talk about the freedom of religion or belief, the state that has signed and ratified the ICCPR has to respect it, which means refrain from actions that would interfere with the right to freedom of religion or belief. The state has to refrain from those actions. Duty to protect means that the state has to protect its individuals who live on its territory, right, from violations by others of the right to freedom of religion or belief, or freedom of expression, or whatever right we're talking about, right? So the state has a duty to protect your freedom of religion or belief from interference from others, businesses, corporations, so on and so forth. By the way, for those of you who are going to law school or interested in the law, that's a very different, the international human rights system thinks of duty to protect in a very different way than the US Constitution does. The US Constitution only limits the power of government. It says nothing about the power of private individuals, right? When people say, it's freedom of speech, I can say whatever I want, right? And, Facebook decides to, because of hate speech laws, right, you violate one of their community rules on violence or hate speech or pornography, and they decide to basically shut your account down. When you go back to them and say, oh, what are you guys doing? Freedom of speech, right? Facebook is going to come back and say, I'm sorry, but I'm not the government. The First Amendment does not apply to me, right? The First Amendment only applies to states and the federal government, not to private companies, not to individuals, not to private corporations, right? Very different in the international human rights field, because when you sign and ratify a treaty, right, you are saying that you're going to protect the individuals in your territory from interference by private parties, right? Not just the state, but by private parties and private entities. And then there's a duty to fulfill, which is basically that if your right to freedom of religion or belief is violated, right, and it happens, you should have what? You should have access to what? Anyone?
Redress.
Yes, you should have access to redress, right? You should have access to courts, right? You should be able to sue someone. You should be able to force the state to allow you to build a house of worship, if in fact, you win your case, right? That there has to be some way to fulfill and realize those rights once those rights are violated, okay? All right. Article 5 of the ICCPR, and I'm slowly getting to Article 18, which is the article we really care about, right? Article 5 of the ICCPR says, nothing in the present covenant, ICCPR, may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the other rights or freedoms. What does that mean? That means that you can't use freedom of expression and opinion to destroy freedom of religion or belief. You cannot use freedom to be free from, well, non-discrimination is different. You can't use freedom of privacy, right, to destroy freedom of expression. You can't pit rights against each other to destroy one, right? They are mutually enforcing. Query, in real life, is anything really mutually enforcing? Or is everything a zero-sum game? That's more of a philosophical question, let's not get into it. But the law, I mean, my boss always says that equality and freedom of religion or belief are mutually reinforcing, right? But Masterpiece Cake Shop seems to indicate that they are not mutually enforcing. Masterpiece Cake Shop seems to indicate that if Phillips, the baker, wins, equality and non-discrimination lose, right? If the customers who wanted the cake for their gay wedding win, then maybe his freedom of religion loses. That's the narrative that Masterpiece Cake Shop sets up. That's the narrative that my boss tries to quash. I don't know how successful he is. I sometimes quiz him on it and I poke him on it as to whether or not, in fact, these rights are all mutually exclusive or mutually reinforcing, or whether they are not. Okay, now let's talk about Article 18. All right. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right shall include freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his, I would also say her, of his or her choice, and freedom either individually or in community with others, and in public or in private, to manifest her religion or belief in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. Okay? So that's Article 18-1 of the ICCPR. Okay? There was a huge debate when this article was being drafted as to whether or not it should say individuals have the right to change their religion. A huge debate. And the ICCPR decided to just sidestep that debate and not use the words change. Right? Why? Why was there a big debate as to whether or not we should have the right to adopt, what was it? The right to have or to adopt or to change our religions? Because if you have the right to adopt your religion or to have a religion, doesn't it kind of imply that you also have the right to change your religion? Yes, it does. But they decided not to use the words change. Why?
I mean, we were saying before, I mean, how frequently and how quickly can you change? That's one thing.
Okay, yeah, we were having a discussion as to sincerity of belief. If one day you wake up and you say, I'm Jewish, and another day you wake up and you say, I'm Muslim, and another day you wake up and you say, I'm X, Y, Z, whatever, right? So yeah, okay, there is that question, but there's actually another somewhat of a political question.
Well, what if you don't change or if you don't have a religion, period?
Okay, all right, but the or belief portion of that basically would be that, you may not have any religion at all. So yeah, to have or to adopt, to have also means to not have, to adopt also means to not adopt, right? Yes?
Related to the theocratic places where it might be a problem to change?
So yeah, there are states, right? Many of them in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, right? Where Islam is the official state religion, right? And in fact, in some of those countries, right, it's unlawful to change your religion, right? Now, whether or not that's actually implemented in law is a different story, right? But it exists. The threat of punishment for changing your religion, changing out of your religion exists, right? And by the way, it's not only in Islamic countries, right? There is a huge debate right now in India regarding proselytization. There are lots of anti-proselytization laws in India because many states in India are not happy with the fact that Christian missionaries are going to India, right? And what are they doing? They're proselytizing, right? Usually to Dalits, right? We used to, when I was growing up, they were termed, in quotes, the untouchables, right? The lower castes, right? Who are actually going to Christianity, well, because they find it to be helpful to their individual lot in life, right? And so there's this tension in India with regard to this issue of changing your religion, right? So anyway, it doesn't really matter. Effectively, you have the right to change your religion under Article 18 of the ICCPR, okay? 2, no one shall be subject to coercion which would impair her freedom to have or to adopt or to change, I'm throwing that in there, a religion or belief of her choice. No coercion. That actually goes to the forum internum. That is absolutely protected. There cannot be coercion in forcing you to subscribe to a religious belief, right? Or to a non-belief, right? That's why Albania, which is a country that we visited, fascinating country. My boss did a visit there, a country visit, to look into the situation of freedom of religion or belief in Albania. Albania was one of the only countries, may have in fact been the only country that was officially atheist during the communist era, right? And there are all sorts of interesting things in terms of, reparations and giving back land that was confiscated from the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church and the Muslim community in Albania, right? Okay, so there can be no coercion in religion. And then the third one, which is the one that most human rights people talk about most of the time, which is the forum externum issue. Okay? Freedom to manifest one's religion or belief may be subject only to such limitations as are 1, prescribed by law, and are 2, necessary, and 3, to protect public safety, public order, health, or morals. That's a tough one. Or morals. What exactly is or morals, right? Or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Those are the conditions which a state can legally interfere with your right to freedom of religion or belief, your manifestation of right, of freedom of religion or belief, for those reasons. There has to be a law that specifically says why they're doing it. It has to be necessary, and the necessity test is kind of like it has to be proportional. right? It has to be proportional to what they're trying to do, okay? And they can only do it for public safety, order, health, morals, fundamental rights, and freedoms of others. Okay, public safety, all right. So there are lots of countries that have, that limit, religious practices for public safety reasons, right? If you decide to limit a religion based on public safety, right? Do you automatically win? What else do you have to prove? Anyone?
Well, it's necessary, right?
Yep, it has to be necessary, right? And it has to be proportionate to the harm that you're trying to restrict or limit, right? I just want to kind of give you an example of that. There was a lot that I talked about, but there's a lot that I could still continue to talk about. I only have 5 minutes. We'll do some of that in the Q&A. I have a feeling that the Q&A will probably bring out some of this other stuff. Yeah, but the two other articles that I wanted to quickly talk about that are very much related to freedom of religion or belief is freedom of expression and opinion, right? Which in this country, First Amendment, freedom of speech. Those two rights are quite often actually in tension, seemingly in tension. My boss would say, no, they're not in tension, mutually reinforcing. Okay, all right, Dr. Shahid, fine, right? I believe him. They are mutually reinforcing, but there is tension set up there. Freedom of expression or opinion, by the way, is also a qualified right. The state can restrict our freedom of speech, right? In the United States, there are restrictions of freedom of speech all the time, right? And in international human rights law, they can do it for the same reasons that they can restrict freedom of religion or belief, right? Prescribed by law, necessary to protect. Here they say national security. Oh boy. Like every time I hear national security as a human rights person, my eyes glaze over and I'm like, states always restrict things based on public order, national security, so on and so forth, right? Public order, public health, morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Here, when I read morals, let me just kind of put, for those of you who were like, morals, why would you have morals as a justification to restrict a fundamental human right? Let me put your mind at ease, to a certain extent, okay? Morals should apply equally to everyone. You cannot pick and choose between morals. So a country that has an official religion cannot restrict a minority religion's practice, right, if they're only doing it for them and not for others, right? So, morals may be akin to a law saying that you can't go out in public anymore, right? That could also have public safety, right? Public health, public order, right? There could be other justifications for that, but that could be maybe a reason for morals as well. So that's one way to kind of limit it so that it's not applied in a discriminatory manner. And then I just want to quickly talk about hate speech, right? We talked about hate speech, which is something that maybe a lot of you are kind of interested in, or what exactly is hate speech. I said there is no definition in international human rights law of hate speech. There is no definition in US law of hate speech. Hate speech is this very kind of fluid, it's in the eye of the beholder, what hate speech is, okay? But there is an article in the ICCPR, Article 20-2, that says the following: any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. The United States doesn't like that article. The United States has opted out of that article. They have a reservation to that article. So one thing states get to do, because they're states and they're all cool, is that when there's a treaty, right, they can say, oh, I like this one, I don't like this article, I like this article. They can have reservations to particular articles of the treaty that they don't like. Yes?
What article is that?
Article 20-2. Right? The United States has essentially, it doesn't have a reservation, it technically has a declaration that says anything that violates our First Amendment jurisprudence, essentially, right, we opt out of. Article 20-2 is believed by international jurists to violate the First Amendment of the US Constitution. Right? Because in this country, the First Amendment protects hate speech. People don't like to hear that, right? Again, you should ask, well, what do you mean by hate speech, right? But insulting, venomous language towards other individuals, right? As long as it's not a threat, right? You're not targeting that individual. As long as there isn't imminent incitement to some sort of we have this doctrine in First Amendment law called fighting words, a very famous case, Chaplinsky, Supreme Court case, I think from the 1940s or 50s, right? If you are engaging in speech that, because of the context, it's very context specific, right? Could incite others to imminent violence, right? The state may be able to actually restrict your ability to say that. Yes?
I just don't understand how use of hate speech isn't a risk to public safety. Because I think a lot of violence can come out of hate speech, not only verbal violence, but physical violence. So I don't understand how it could restrict religious practices.
Good. Okay. If I said that hate speech is not a threat to public safety, shame on me. I didn't mean to say that. I hope I didn't say that.
Oh, no, I was just wondering where the legal line is between the two things.
Perfect question, right? So under Article 19.3, which is freedom of expression, right, public safety can be used, okay? But it has to be necessary, right? And it has to, the problem with hate speech often is how do you define it, right? Because something that may be considered, and this is more of a philosophical discussion, right? I can assure you that if we had a straw poll as to and went around the room and said what is hate speech and what isn't, there would be a bunch of things that maybe all of us, maybe with the exception of a couple of people, I don't know, right, may agree that it's hate speech, right? And then we would disagree on all the rest of the stuff, all the rest of it. I've done this actually. I do this with my family, which is why my family just can't stand being around me during the dinner table, right? It's really, really, really hard, right? And so the idea of the First Amendment is that the threshold has to be so high, right, that speech has to lead to imminent violence, right? Or it's a direct threat at someone, in which case you can restrict it. Or the classic example that everyone talks about, yelling fire in a crowded theater, right? Because that can lead to imminent, that there's an imminent danger in doing that, right? There are also lots of other restrictions on speech, by the way, right? National security reasons, classified information, so on and so forth. This is all why the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression is a qualified right. It's not an absolute right. So when people keep saying, it's my First Amendment right, free speech, yeah, okay, but the First Amendment also has restrictions on your right to be able to speak. Okay? All right, I'm going to stop here.
About free speech zones.
But maybe that's going to be the first question. Maybe that's going to be the first question.
So
I want to talk about it.
So to make sure we show our love now and later, we'll clap and then we'll clap again at the end. So thank you very much, and this has very much kind of been a conversation. So what we're really doing is just kind of continuing the conversation. So this will be our first question, and then if you would raise your hand, I'll try to recognize you and remember the order, and then we'll probably spend about the next, say, 25 to 30 minutes doing a Q&A, okay? So so your question was, what about
Free speech zones?
free speech zones?
Okay,
You're not allowed
so
to have free speech anywhere you want, basically.
say that
They
again.
have that during protests and stuff like that.
Right. Okay, so let me get to that. Let me just also say one quick thing here, which is that one thing that I didn't really, because I went off on tangents and all sorts of other things, I didn't really talk about the implementation of international human rights law. So let me just kind of throw something quickly at you, and then I'll go to your question, which is that the problem you have with implementation and enforcement of international human rights law is what? What is the biggest problem with enforcing and implementing international human rights law?
That it's not binding on anyone.
Well, it's binding on the states to sign and ratify the treaties.
Okay, but I have in mind the sanctuary cases in the U.S. in the 1980s. Sanctuary activists argued that they were justified in harboring immigrants who were undocumented because of, I think it was the 1980 Refugee Act. that the US has signed on to. But that act also said it won't override any national, laws or provisions, et cetera. So isn't that the case though, that international law, like there is the World Court, but is it really binding on somebody?
Okay, that's the key, right? So you talked about the World Court, which is in The Hague, right? Which is the International Court of Justice, right? It's also called the International Court of Justice. Actually, the real problem is that there are no world courts, right? The World Court does exist, but it doesn't deal with human rights law, right? It deals with other disputes, like territorial disputes between states, right? Treaty disputes between states, right? It doesn't really deal with directly human rights law. So there is no international human rights court, right? There is no international human rights police, right? There is no enforcement mechanism for international human rights law. So you're partly right.
Is the World Court for criminal, like war crimes?
So that's the ICC. That's the International Criminal Court, which, by the way, just convicted. I think Karadzic in Bosnia just got a life sentence. His sentence was increased to a life sentence, I think, for crimes against humanity. I don't think they got him on genocide, but I'm not sure. Professor Simoni may know that better. But that's a different court that deals with atrocity crimes, right? So it deals with the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, mostly. So that's a little bit different. It is related to human rights, right? But the United States, by the way, is not a signatory and has not ratified the Rome Statute. Therefore, the ICC has no jurisdiction over the United States, at least not directly. It actually does have jurisdiction over US personnel. I won't get into that. But the biggest challenge is that there's no enforcement mechanism. So there are these things like my boss, my former boss, the UN Special Rapporteur, who goes around and talks about human rights and how it's important and how states should, abide by it, right? But he doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. There are mechanisms at the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, there's the Security Council, generally doesn't deal with human rights issues, right? There is the Universal Periodic Review. I won't get into all of this stuff, right? But there are monitoring mechanisms to make sure that countries that have signed and ratified human rights treaties are following their obligations. But when they don't follow their obligations, which happens all the time, the only thing they really get is the flap right? China is now, interning, the reports suggest, hundreds of thousands of Uyghur Muslims, right? In Xinjiang province in eastern China, right? What has happened? Has the international community done much about that? Nope. Not much. Not only has the international community not done much about it, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which you would think would be outspoken about the fact that their Muslim brothers and sisters, are being detained arbitrarily, essentially in concentration camps, right, in China, has not said much. Why? Political reasons, right? Close relationships to China, economic reasons, political reasons. Okay, free speech zones. All right.
Yeah,
So
I got arrested at a protest
okay.
for walking down the street. They just pulled me up the street and arrested me at the Republican convention.
At a public convention?
At a Republican convention.
At a Republican
In
convention.
New York City.
Right, right.
But I got $5,000 10 years later for it though.
Okay. Okay. So without getting into the details of your criminal record, Trump does a rally. This is more personal. Trump does a rally at the convention center is there a convention center in this close to this area, let's say, right?
NJ Pack.
Meadowlands.
Oh,
Meadowlands.
there you go.
Is that where the Giants play? All right. The Meadowlands, right? And can Trump and his followers restrict your freedom of speech in that area when in the Meadowlands? That's what happened to you? You were inside, or you were on public property?
I was on public property.
You were on public
That was
property.
just an example, but I was asking about free speech zones.
Right.
Like, how's that constitutional?
Well, it depends on where the free speech zone is, right? And what we mean by the free speech zone, right? If the First Amendment prevents any government, whether it's local government, right, state government, or the federal government, from interfering with your free speech rights. They can interfere, remember, it's qualified, so there are certain circumstances where they can interfere with it, right? But it only restricts the government, right? So I don't know the circumstances of when, what happened with you particularly, right? But you can be thrown in prison for disorderly conduct, you can be thrown in prison for trespassing. That may not be the case, right? But I mean, there could be all sorts of other reasons why someone could be, if there is no way that a state, if you're just walking down the street and you have a placard, right? Generally speaking, a state cannot throw you in prison for what you're saying on the placard. Now, they may do this. There are time, place, manner restrictions. There are public spaces that, for public safety reasons and public order reasons, the state can say, you know what, you have free speech rights, right? But from the hours of 8 to whatever, or midnight, from midnight to 4 in the morning, you can't go in a public park and protest, right? So we're going to restrict where you can do it, but we're not doing it because we don't like what you say. We're doing it because there are other reasons, public safety or public order reasons for restricting your rights. So a free speech zone may be, again, I don't know the circumstances, a state saying this is a time, place, manner restriction, right? It's neutral. It is not targeting the subject of your speech, right? It is only creating a small restriction and saying you can't do it here, but you can do it here. So that they can do. And they can do it under international human rights law, and they can do it under First Amendment jurisprudence in the United States. I don't know if that answers your question.
Right.
But
So you can't just go on a sidewalk and just say whatever you want, basically.
you can go on, well, I mean, you generally can go on a sidewalk and say whatever you want. But for instance, there may be permit requirements, right, for having a rally somewhere. Why? Because the local city says, okay, well, if you're going to have 5,000 people, you can't do it on a sidewalk because you're going to block traffic, right? So we're going to require you to get a permit. Now, if they're using the permit as a way to restrict they don't like what you say, they don't like you and your friends, they don't like the New York Giants, you're wearing a Giants hat, right? And you're going to go to a New York Giants rally. I don't like the New York Giants either, but, right? And if they don't like what you want to say, and they like restrict your permit rights, right? That's different because they're actually targeting the substance of your speech. But they can actually have you go somewhere else to do it. That's more convenient to a big rally.
Like specifically,
And we can actually talk a little bit more about this later, just to
sorry.
give us. It's okay.
Talk to you
Just-
after.
yeah, no, I think it's great. He's one of my students. I'm so proud of him. So yes, no, we can definitely talk more about it, but just in the interest of getting to other people. So yes, please.
Hi, my name's Faraz Sanei. I'm a professor at the Justice Department here. I have sort of a question dovetailing on this hate speech issue based on a small comment. I'm sure whether you're familiar with the Hartford guidelines for sort of the speech crimes in the International Criminal Law.
Okay.
Or not,
I'm not too familiar with
yeah,
it, but
not,
yeah.
This would be a great resource to share with everyone here. I can send it to Kate and she'll distribute it.
Yeah.
But the idea is what I'd like you to answer a look at is the connection between, we've been talking about the SSPR and how they were ratified in the 60s. We finally signed it under Carter and then ratified by many in the 60s, but only by the US in the 90s with these reservations. And so my question would be, to what extent, and you can maybe explore this, to what extent can international law help in fostering a better environment, nationally speaking? Because you mentioned the Karadzic trial and many of the trials that for Rwanda and the ICTR and the ICTY were really trailblazing with regards to implementing hate speech, with regards to inciting genocide, and I think that taps into that small conversation, right? If I'm on the sidewalk saying whatever I want about Jews, about Muslims, or whoever, I mean, that's my freedom of speech, right? But in our environment currently, under the current administration, with the rise of white supremacists and the way they've come back, that is a very, very difficult and dangerous situation. One has only to go back to the Nazi regimes with the Stürmer, the striker, that he was sitting on his farm saying, blurting out these things, right? And so maybe you can make that link, since you're a lawyer, international lawyer, what the value is of international law, where you say like it's just a tap on the wrist early with human rights violations, but how can it actually permeate with regards to procedures that get them adopted?
Wow, if I could answer that question, I would just retire right now. I mean, what you're raising is something that international human rights lawyers are frankly always kind of sheepish about, because we always have to go around and prove to people that international human rights law actually matters, that international law actually matters, and then you have, the Bush administration and the Trump administration and others like, none of this stuff actually matters, right? It doesn't matter. You can't do anything. I mean, there's now a, they're going to restrict the ICC, personnel from the ICC, right, to come to the United States because there's a possibility that the US personnel may be investigated for atrocity crimes committed in Afghanistan, which is in fact a signatory to the Rome Statute. Okay, so you raise this big issue as to whether or not international law can actually impact, or international human rights law can impact, and I think it can. I think it can, right? There are standards, so you talked about the Hartford guidelines, right? Which I'm not familiar with, unfortunately. But, the Revolt Plan of Action, right? The Revolt Plan of Action is an international guideline which is used to figure out 20-2, remember I read 20-2, incitement to hatred, right? And discrimination based on religion, nationality, ethnicity, race, so on and so forth. There are guidelines that were developed on how to actually implement 20-2, because 20-2 doesn't say anything other than that. It's just one sentence. How are states supposed to know how to actually implement it? So there are all these tests, like the context matters, the speaker matters, the audience matters, so on and so forth, right? Some of these tests are have a lot more cachet in certain countries than they do in others. This country, maybe because it prides itself, rightly or wrongly, I'll leave that to the audience, as being the bastion of, human rights and First Amendment and free speech, believes that its free speech, right, which has a very high threshold, even in times like this, has a very high threshold. And I agree with you that, it's just not true that sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never. It's just not true. Words hurt. Words hurt, and they lead to horrible, horrible things. Right? The question we all struggle with is, do we want to give states the power to limit? Because states often have other motives and ulterior motives to limit speech. And oftentimes, hate speech laws in countries don't actually affect the majority populations. They, in fact, affect the minority populations in practice. Doesn't mean it has to be that way. Right? But oftentimes, that's what happens. So, there's a resolution called Human Rights Council Resolution 1618 for combating intolerance, right? I've spent way too many waking hours and sleeping hours dreaming about HRC 1618 and how states can actually implement it. It has an 8-point action plan. The focus of that action plan, right, the general kind of ethos is that if you want to fight hate speech, fight it with more good speech. Don't restrict. Only restrict a particular subcategory of speeches. Incitement to genocide, right, under international law, prohibited and should be prohibited by law. Incitement to violence, racial, ethnic violence, but there's an incitement component. That's where a lot of the hate speech stuff falls through, right? Because hate speech in and of itself may not incite anything. It may be terribly hurtful. It may be horrible, gross, all sorts of things, right? But it may not incite anyone to do anything. Incitement is trying to create a connection or a nexus between the speech and action, right? We know that speech leads to action, but the nexus has to be very short. The time frame has to be very short. That's why 1618 doesn't only say incitement, it says immediate incitement. That's the only time you can actually limit that type of speech, right? But conceptually, what does that mean? What does that mean? How does one determine if this speech is going to immediately incite or just incite, right? And what about all the speech that's toxic, that creates a toxic environment cumulatively, right? We all know that it does, and it leads to horrible action. What, we can't limit that speech? Right? So Article 19, which is an NGO that I'm working with now, named after Article 19 of the ICCPR, Freedom of Expression and Opinion, right? They say, yes, incitement to, hostility, hatred, religious hatred, whatever, that can be limited, and there should be laws limiting it, right? But it should be only used as a last resort. States, instead of trying to prohibit speech, instead of trying to censor, should have counter speech. Query whether or not that works, right? I mean, there are lots of progressive criticisms of the First Amendment, as we all know, right? And there's a lot of progressive criticism of this idea of not having laws that restrict hate speech, right? The problem is some of the things that I mentioned, right? What is hate speech? How do you determine what hate speech is, right? Where's the line between immediate incitement and non-immediate incitement, right? Those are all really, really difficult issues, at least from lawyers. Maybe others, maybe the anthropologists and sociologists and others have figured it out. Philosophers, maybe they figured it out. We lawyers haven't figured it out. Yeah.
I think David maybe, and then,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, didn't you have your hand up earlier?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
It seems to me that also there's, with respect to free speech zones and such, right, there's the issue of you could have freedom of speech, that doesn't mean that anyone has to listen.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like the government cannot force someone to they don't have to provide you an audience, right?
Right. So that's the whole issue where we talk about the freedom to have an audience or a platform, right? That doesn't necessarily exist in First Amendment jurisprudence. By the way, I'm not a First Amendment person per se. I mean, I'm getting more into. I spent all these years getting away from U.S. law, and then now I've been doing international human rights law for a while, and now I'm kind of getting back into U.S. law a little bit because it's interesting. Especially establishment clause cases, free exercise cases. But yeah, you're right. I mean, you don't necessarily have a right to a platform or an audience, right? The right is mostly a negative right. It doesn't mean the state has to furnish you with an audience. It means the state should not restrict your ability to speak. So that's the difference. It's the difference between positive rights and negative rights. Refraining from interfering as opposed to providing someone with housing, right? Providing someone with education, which is, by the way, the reason why the United States doesn't like the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, because it has a right to education, a right to housing, a right to clean water, and the United States says, I know I'm going on a tangent, but I'm just going to throw it in there, right? The United States says, no, our Constitution is about negative rights. Our Constitution doesn't say, there is no constitutional right in this country to education. Did you guys know that? It does not exist. As a matter of fact, under most state constitutions, there is no constitutional right to an education. The great state of Connecticut has a right to education. There you go. Yes.
I think Dorothy and then Damien. Oh, I'm sorry, and we had another hand back here. Okay.
I don't know who's.
I think it's Dorothy, then Damien, then yeah.
Okay.
So I like to think about the comparing Canada. Wait, was that person going?
I don't think so.
I like to think about Canada, our neighbor to the north, because they have very clear hate speech guidelines, I think. They also have a state religion technically, right? And you have to register. I think, don't you have to register your religious group? Which sounds very, very, big brotherish, controlling government-ish.
Yeah.
But they have a really thriving democracy. So I don't know if that's very helpful. The reason I thought of this at all is that some feminists in the 1980s and 90s got some progress made on claiming that pornography was an action, not just speech. And they actually got some progress in Canada, but not here. Here, they have absolutely no way. In Canada, they actually listen to some of it seriously, talk about harm, against women, etc. But I wonder if there are those kinds of examples that help inform the discussion, because Canada, people who complain about hate speech regulations here are afraid it's going to become a very authoritarian government, politically correctness thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in Canada, it doesn't seem to operate that way.
So one thing, and this goes back to the fact that I'm somewhat of a generalist and don't actually have that much, intimate knowledge of all the country laws. But I'll look into Canada. I'm not familiar with its hate speech legislation. I don't think Canada has an official religion. I could be wrong about that. Registration.
I thought the Church of Canada was their religion. It's very liberal. It's like the Unitarians are here.
I don't think so. I mean, there's this whole thing with is the Queen of England does the Queen of England have any sort of relationship to Canada because Canada was a former. I mean, the Queen of England is the head of the Anglican Church. I don't know if that's kind of the wraparound there. Maybe it is. But I don't think they do. Registration, you mentioned registration. Registration is actually a very interesting issue because lots of countries have registration requirements. And the question always is, that can be a limitation on the manifestation of religion, right? But the question is it being used in a discriminatory manner? Is it targeting? Is there a public safety reason? Is it necessary? So on and so forth, right? So there's a whole calculation that goes there. But to your larger question, I think the answer is yes. I think it goes to something that your colleague up there also talked about, this idea that international law, and in fact what other countries are doing, can help inform what we do in this country. I think that this country, though, I was naturalized in this country. I'm very, I'm happy that I'm American, but I gotta say, every once in a while, it's like they think that it's that the shining, what was it on the hill, the city on, yeah, this exceptionalism, this idea of American exceptionalism, right? That we do everything better than everybody else. We have a unique history that nobody else has, and therefore we have nothing to learn from the Canadas and the Australias and the Germanys and whatever else it is, right? Right? This idea exists, but in fact, there are so many interesting ways that the international human rights field is kind of having this iterative effect with domestic law, and then domestic law is helping kind of shape international law, right? I mean, international law cannot exist without implementation at the domestic level, right? It cannot exist. It's meaningless without it. So there's plenty to learn, right? And I guess the one that I'll just throw my plug in here for this idea of what's it called? Like bans on semi-assault rifles and all this other stuff, right? I know we have a Second Amendment. All right, I know we have a Second Amendment. I'm not going to get into a Second Amendment this discussion, but this idea that it's really that hard to limit the number of deaths, and that access to guns has nothing to do with deaths is crazy and ridiculous, right? There may be other reasons there. I'm not saying there aren't other reasons there, but plenty of other countries have found a way, right? And they don't have a Second Amendment, okay? And there's a legal issue there, right? But plenty of other countries have found a way to address this issue. It's not rocket science. Sorry, that was just my own. Going off on a tangent because.
Yeah, Damien.
Just to say we have lots to learn from other countries.
Yeah, and I think we have at least one question, and then we have one question up here. You still have your question, and then we have this question, and we'll see where we are. Okay? Yeah.
Actually, I have it's kind of like a couple.
Can you just ask one for me since we got two other people waiting?
Okay, so first of all, which one's the one that, out of Article 18, I think it was one clause that the U.S. just doesn't like?
No, it was Article 20-2 that has to do with incitement to discrimination, violence, hate speech that basically is incitement.
So that's the one.
That's the one.
On that, because of the whole, rallies and things, thanks to Trump himself, inciting all of, technically, hate speech because of how he speaks,
right.
Inciting all this violence and his influence on people that creates the hate speech, that creates all of this violence and so on within our country, and apparently it's extending obviously internationally now. Is there anything that covers that?
So
technically, the U.S. doesn't like that, but
right. So this is actually it's like a law school hypothetical, right? Except it's not. It happens at the rallies, right? There's Trump says something. There's a crowd. They're getting riled up. He says something. I don't know. He said plenty of things. I mean, we have plenty of examples. But the question is this, right? For 20-2, this is my lawyerness coming out, which some of you may hate. But it doesn't mean I don't see where you're going with it. But let me just kind of do this, right? Any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Incitement to discrimination. Let's put aside the incitement to discrimination issue because that's conceptually a more difficult one. An easy one is incitement to violence. That's pretty easy, right? Is Trump at his rallies, right, inciting violence, right? Is he inciting violence? That's the first question. And the second question is he inciting violence on the basis of national, racial, or religious hatred. The examples that we've seen of him doing that, I'm just now using Article 20-2, right? Because that's what you referred to. Is there an argument that Trump is inciting violence based on national, racial, religious hatred, inciting violence based on those at his rallies?
I think the most concerning moment was when the man who made the gesture with the middle finger and was hit by somebody, and he said, the current occupant of the White House said right then, boy, back in the old days, he would have been dragged out of here, and implying he should have been beaten up.
Right.
But I think that's the harshest, obvious statement that our current leader has said, but it doesn't cross that line. It didn't result in people pouncing on him and then pummeling him. You know, if it had resulted in action, that might have been different, but it isn't based on nationality, religion, or what was the other one?
Nationality, religion, or race. Race.
Well, he has,
What does Trump have to do to violate Article 20-2? What does he have to do at his rally?
actually
They
threaten
hit him
people
now.
and direct people to harm other people.
Right.
Yeah.
To say go.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That would be incitement to violence. That would be clean. You've got a rally, you've got a closed space, right? You've got cheering fans, right? The person who's getting targeted would say mob, right? And explicitly or directly, right, or indirectly, it's clear that race, religion, or nationality is playing a role in his, or he directs someone, go after that, guy because he is X, do it now, get rid of him, beat him to a bloody pulp. I mean, I don't know. The way he's going, he may get there. He may get there. He may cross that threshold very easily. I don't know, right? But it's a pretty high threshold, right? It's a pretty high threshold. I think your answer generally, though, goes back to what your colleague said there, is that words matter, right? That this environment, this toxic environment does matter, right? And the question is, for us lawyers, the question is, can we address it by laws, or are there other ways to address it? Or is it a combination of the two, right? I always like the combination because it's kind of like hedging, right? As a lawyer, it's like you want to be here and here, right? So everyone, you're cool with everybody, right? I don't know. I don't know whether this type of stuff lends itself to legal regulation. This is not my own personal view, right? But I also don't know that good counter speech necessarily counters the negative toxic effects of bad speech, right?
And so I think we have 2 more questions, and I want to exercise a quick privilege here. One thing that is really interesting is that even if it doesn't legally meet the threshold, you have people who are committing acts of violence that cite Trump as part of what emboldened them to do those actions. So that's a whole nother kind of standard I think that's really interesting.
That is an interesting standard, but
Yeah.
sets up all sorts of problems legally, I
Right.
think. But it is an interesting
But it's
standard.
an interesting standard. Yeah.
I don't know if you want to answer this, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were as to more effectively evaluate prosecution, or the correct prosecution for hate speech, and what is hate speech, and what is a threat to public safety. Because I feel like with the judicial system we have in place now, it's not effective in actually evaluating the cases that are really going through this now. So I was just wondering, from your perspective as a professional, how we could better evaluate and navigate the situations and cases.
I think it goes back to many of the challenges that I'm talking about here for why civil liberties advocates. I mean, look, the ACLU, right? ACLU, you guys all know the ACLU or know of the ACLU, right? I like a lot of the stuff they do, right? I'm just gonna tell you, I support the ACLU. Most of the stuff they do, right? The ACLU is not on board with hate speech restrictions in the United States, right? Now, the calculus has changed a little bit after Charlottesville, Their calculus has changed. There was a huge debate within the ACLU after Charlottesville, right? Why? Because who was the ACLU representing in Charlottesville? Who were they representing?
The original protesters, the white supremacist group.
Right.
They supported the Nazis.
They supported the Nazis marching through Skokie, Illinois, right? In the 1940s, 50s, I can't remember exactly, or 60s, I can't remember what decade it was, marching through, you know, the KKK, or was it, I don't know if it was the KKK or the Nazis, marching through a community of Holocaust survivors. The ACLU defended the rights of the KKK and Nazis to march through, and they were obviously doing it to send a message, right? They weren't doing it just going, oh, Skokie's a cool place to go to, right? They were doing it to send a message, right? And the ACLU defended them, right? So now comes Charlottesville, and the death of, I don't remember her name. Does anyone remember her name?
Heather.
Heather, right? And they were defending the ability of those individuals to be able to get a permit, right, in the center of town, because the city of Charlottesville didn't want to do it, right? The city of Charlottesville said, I don't want to deal with this stuff, right? You guys can go to a park that's 3 miles away from the center of town. You want to do that? That's fine. We're not restricting your free speech rights, time, place, manner restrictions, right? Free speech zones, right? We're gonna take you somewhere else. And the ACLU said, no. You're doing it because you don't like the content of the speech, right? It's not a neutral restriction that you're placing on them. You're saying you don't like the content of their speech. And under the First Amendment, that speech is protected. Under the First Amendment, it's protected, right? So there is a debate now within the ACLU, and the debate is somewhat along the lines of like, we have limited resources, and frankly, should we be defending these people or should we be defending other people? And also, the discussion is, you know, we are no longer going to defend the free speech rights of individuals who want to carry arms. That's a restriction that the ACLU has now imposed on itself, right? Because there were people who shot guns at the rallies in Charlottesville, right? They had the right to carry those guns, right? They had a permit for it, but anyway. Like, so that's causing a little bit of a realization moment for the ACLU. But going back to your question, I mean, I don't know if I've done a good job of answering it at all. You know, courts have a difficult time with this issue in the United States and lots of other places, right? And again, one of the biggest problems with hate speech laws, right, is that oftentimes they're used against the weak, or when I say weak, the vulnerable, right? Against minorities, against other people, right? Not against the majority, not against the powerful, right? And that sets up this idea that the state, maybe we don't want the state to have the power to decide what is hate speech and what is not hate speech, right? Because civil libertarians don't necessarily trust the state to censor, right? But then what do you do with all this stuff? All this stuff that's out there that's bad, what do you do with it, right? Do you put out public service campaigns, you know, against hate? Sure, that's counter speech. That's positive counter speech. That's something that states can do, right? I'm at a loss.
And this will be our last question, I think, for the evening. Yeah?
I just like to thank you again for coming to Montclair and speaking. And I'd like to know if you had any sort of preconceived opinions about, you know, religion.